King of Charmander's here. Alright, so I actually decided to do Holiday Cup videos on things that wall other things in the Holiday Cup. So one of the most notable picks is the most ridiculous, it's the Lord and Savior, the greatest, the gods of all gods, the believer of all beavers, Justin Belieber, as in Justin Bibarel. If you don't Bibarel, then you must pass and we must sacrifice you. Anyways, Bibarel is actually a giant wall. It's the reason why I'm doing videos on Bibarel is because it actually walls AWAC and Froslass. Because of its typing of being a normal and water type, it does actually resist ice, and it also resists ghost and fire. Because of that, Bibarel is actually not a bad idea for the Holiday Cup. In the fact that it walls two of either popular leads or very powerful switches, which you can depend is going to be on other teams, because I use it as well. So as you see, as I mentioned, Justin Bibarel is actually able to double resist. So double resist Ghost, Ice, Fire, which is Alolan Marowak and Froslass. You're also able to pretty much wall all the other Ghost types in the meta that do damage and force them to either use their other neutral moves or, basically use their other neutral moves, like Bone Club from Alolan Marowak, or the Foul Plays from Sableye. Hopefully, if you do happen to encounter a Haunter and it doesn't have Sludge Bomb, guess what? You do wall that as well, so it's really interesting. Now, the thing about Bibarel is its weaknesses are very prevalent. It is weak to Electric, Fighting, and Grass, so because of that, you have to watch out for all the Pseudo Fighters, the Venusaurs, and those Volt Switches from those A-Grabs. So, while you do wall a few particular targets, you are weak to a lot of big weaknesses that actually are flying around in the Holiday Cup. As you see, Bibarel is kind of not bulky, but it's decently bulky, and it also has a decent attack. Now, the reason why Bibarel is kind of interesting, well, it's interesting because of one, it does resist all the other picks, as I mentioned, Froslass and AWAC. That's your main reason for using Bibarel, and it's actually pretty good against some of the meta types or some of the archetypes in Holiday Cup. Now, it doesn't have the greatest moveset in the world. Water Gun charges things very slowly. Takedown, you will never use Takedown, don't even bother. It also has Hyper Fang, Surf, and one of the most powerful moves in the game as in Hyper Beam. You can actually use Bibarel's Hyper Beam because most of the time you'll be either using Surf or Water Gun, or you'll Hyper Beam everything to death. And if you do land a Hyper Beam, it does heavy damage against a lot of the meta. So I definitely recommend you use Hyper Beam if you're thinking about using Bibarel. Because a lot of times, Hyper Beam will almost actually one-shot things like Obstagoon, Vigoroth, etc. Just because it does so much damage and you actually get stabbed. So that's Justin Bibarel in a nutshell. Alright, so now here's the PBook.com rankings. I'm going to have to look for Bibarel. As you see, Bibarel is 124. Now, the reason you want to use Bibarel is because you want to target two big types, or two big Pokemon in particular, AWAC, or you want to target Froslass, which are almost in a lot of teams guaranteed. If you do get Bibarel locked into them, you have a very strong chance of coming out of that matchup with Shield and Energy Advantage. As you see here, Bibarel does very well against a lot of meta picks as well. It does well against of course, AWAC and Froslass, as we mentioned. You're also good against Diggersby because it's ground. You also take on things like Dugong and Lapras. You are actually able to not wall them, but have a strong matchup against the Ice-Water hybrid tanks because you're able to resist Icy Wind, Water Pulse, and Surf. You're also able to take out things like Talonflame, Charizard, and Alolan Sandslash. Now, you are weak to actually, most of the flyers in the game. As you see, you do lose to Skarmory and Altaria. Also, fighters do rock your world, which is Obstagoon and Vigoroth. And speaking of rocking your world, Alolan Graveler has a field day with the... Ironically, your Water Guns actually chunk at Alolan Graveler because it is a electric type, so Bibarel actually has some play with like shields, etc. So we'll take a look at it. As you see, very powerful as a lead and especially as a closer. Now, the preferred moveset is Surf and Hyper Fang, but like I mentioned, you can use Hyper Beam, because Hyper Beam actually takes a chunk out of a lot of Pokemon. If you're able to get it down, you can actually farm them down with Water Gun. So, Hyper Beam is not a bad idea. Now, as you see, because Bibarel is kind of like one of those specialty mons where it's targeting 2 particular mons, or for the most part, that's why you're using it. As you see, it's not going to rank very high in a lead on the closer. In the leads, it pretty much beats the same thing as I mentioned before. In the closer, it is able to take on actually Alolan Graveler. As you see here, Surf does heavy damage against Alolan Graveler. That's why you're able to beat it. You're also able to defeat the Charmers and even Charizard, etc. And you also actually have a pretty cool matchup against Stunfisk. So Stunfisk is an electric type and a ground type. Because of that, your water guns do damage. But it hits you with Discharge pretty hard. So it really just depends how it goes. And Bibarel is also like I said, I wouldn't use that as a switch. The only reason you're going to switch into it is because you are trying to, you're locking it into their AWAC or you're locking it into their Froslass. Alright, as I always say, please consider donating at peeppoke.com. Now, these analyses are going to go pretty quick just because Bibarel isn't really a top Metamon, but it's here for a specific reason, for you to destroy Alolan Marowak and the Ice Queen Froslass. If you can destroy the Queen anyway, she will destroy you. She has energy advantage, she'll probably rip your soul in half, but you know what? Froslass is good. And Bibarel is also good, because Justin Bibarel says it's sorry, and it's... it just rips away Froslass. Actually, you'll see, there's actually some scenarios where Froslass can probably win, but I think it's just down shield advantage. Anyways, here's Bibarel with a Surf and Hyper Fang. I also have the Hyper Beam variation, like I mentioned. And Hyper Beam actually lets you flip some matchups, because sometimes you won't. Because Sir Water Gun charges so slow, you might not even get to a Hyper Fang in some scenarios. Here we have the Holiday Cup meta to the right. We have the 2 shield, and then we hit Pladdle. And as you see here, you lose against Bama, you lose against Altaria, you lose against Dugong, and Diggersby in the 2 shield. I think Diggersby is a bait-dependent matchup, sadly. Because what happens is that if you shield the Earthquake, I think you're okay, because you can, as you see here, Earthquake is what ends up killing you. If we don't shield the Fire Punch, because you can actually tank the Fire Punch, call the Fire Punch, as you see, Bibarel wins. As long as you can call the Fire Punch, you win. So you could eat a whole Fire Punch, and then you could just surf it down to death. As you see, you take out Driftblim, and you also take out Froslass. This is one of the 2 big kahunas I'm talking about that you are trying to target. As you see here, Bibarel beats Froslass in every scenario unless it has shield advantage. So that's why it's so strong. As you see here, you beat it in every scenario unless, like I said, it has shield advantage. And these are strong ratings. So as long as you can keep it in even shield scenarios, or if you have more shield, you beat Froslass. You lose against Galvantula because those Volt Switches do hurt a lot. You can actually beat Alolan Graveler into 2 shield. Remember how I mentioned Alolan Graveler is a rock type. Rock is weak to water. And because of that, you can literally Surf's Up, dude. You die to all this water. Pew, pew, pow. You die of all these water guns. As you see, you have to double shield the Rock Blast. You could probably take 1 Rock Blast, but I wouldn't do it because you don't live that long. Actually, you can't. So you have to double shield because these Volt Switches do chunk. So you'll come out of this in even shield scenarios, but as you see, you beat in the 2s and the 0s. You're able to beat Lantern, the Water Gun variation, if you have Hyper Beam. Now you have to this is a bait dependent matchup because you have to double bait the Surf and then you have to Hyper Beam it. No, literally, that's what you have to do because Lantern's going to go straight Thunderbolt on you. It's not going to Hydro Pump you unless they don't know their typings. You lose against Lapras, Magnezone, Mandibuzz, Obstagoon. Remember I mentioned it's a normal type, so guess what happens when you get punched by normal types? It sucks. Here's the second one, Alolan Marowak. This is our other target that we're trying to wall. As you see here, you beat Alolan Marowak in all scenarios. So as long as you match up Justin Bibarel versus Alolan Marowak, it doesn't matter what they do, you will win. So, because you resist both Fire Spins, you also resist Hex. So it doesn't really matter what moveset they have to straight Bone Club you. But it doesn't matter because as long as you line it up with Marowak, you basically destroy it. You also beat Skarmory, Alolan Sandslash, you beat Snorlax, you beat Talonflame as well, because it's a fire type. Now you lose against the Charmers, this is a big one. You lose against Charmers, and you will lose against Shadow Victory Bell, so be careful. Like I mentioned, your job is to lock Bibarel into a positive matchup, particularly 2 most popular patterns, which is Froslass and Alolan Marowak in the 2 shield. Alright, so we had the 2 shield, here's the 1 shield. We're gonna run it. As you see, Bibarel does well in the 2s. It can. I wouldn't use it as a lead. Like I said, lock Bibarel into Froslass or AWAC. That's your play with Bibarel. Bibarel does really well in other scenarios as well. So, for example, the one shield you can beat Dugong. Now, this is a bait dependent matchup because you have to bait with Surf. If you will never get to a Hyper Beam or a Hyper Fang. You can't do it. You beat Diggersby, you beat Driplim, you beat Froslass, of course, as I mentioned, as long as you have even shield scenarios or shield advantage. You lose against the electric types, Lantern, Lapras, Manabuzz, and the ones is where you falter. Again, your two main targets are going to be Froslass and, as you see, Alolan Marowak. You can still beat things like Alolan Sandslash. You can beat Snorlax with the Hyper Fang variation. You can also beat Talonflame. As you see, Bibarel is very weak in the one shield against a lot of the meta. Now in the zeros, Justin Bibarel is actually able to do work against like the two things we mentioned. Froslass and Alolan Marowak. So we beat Froslass, and we also beat Alolan Marowak. You can also beat Agrav in the closer just because you're able to surf it to death. You can beat Dugong with Hyper Beam. So it's funny because Hyper Beam actually has more use than Hyper Fang in this scenario. You beat Diggersby, you also beat Driplim, you beat Froslass, of course, Alolan Grab, as I mentioned. You're going to lose against Galvantula, Lantern, Lapras, Magnezone, Mandibuzz, Obstagoon. You basically died all the fighters. There's no way out. Now, the funny thing is, in the zeros, you beat Talonflame, Alolan Marowak, Alolan Sandslash. You also beat both Charmers as long as you have Hyper Beam. Yes, you actually beam Wigglytuff to death and hashtag get freaking beamed. You live with 5 HP though, so like, as long as if you can beam it, as you see here, it does 195 damage. So you just really need a few water guns before you take it out. So as long as you have some energy and you can beam it, you can actually take out Wigglytuff and Whimsicott. So that's what's really funny about Bibarel. Now on the 1-0s, Bibarel is actually a pretty beastly. Again, the Hyper Beam does actually serve you well. You can actually beam things to death because you're in the zeros. Hyper Beam actually allows you to beat Lantern, both versions of Lantern actually. So you're able to beat a majority of the meta except Abomasnow, Mandibuzz, Obstagoon, Vigoroth. Actually, just 4 matchups. Yeah, Vigoroth, Obstagoon, Mandibuzz, and Abomasnow. And Lantern if you don't have Hyper Beam. So you only lose against 4 matchups in the 1-0s, which isn't that bad. But, of course, you lose primarily against the fighter, so you still can't lock in Bibarel into a fighter, even though you have a 1-0 shield advantage. The 2-0s, even so. So, as you see in the 2-0s, Bibarel actually beats Abomasnow, because you can actually Hyper Beam it to death, or Hyper Fang it to death. As you see in the 2-0s, you actually beat the entire meta. Because Bibarel is either going to beam you or surf you to death. Either one. So, that's funny. Yeah. In the 2-0s, Bibarel beats the entire meta, which is actually pretty huge. In the 2-1s, Bibarel is still really good, except you still lose against things that resist water or like will Volt Switch you to death as long as they can shield and survive. You'll beat Dugong with the beam variation. You have to do... I think you can... Can you just straight Hyper Beam? I don't think you can. I think you have to bait with Surf. I think you have to bait with Surf because you can't go straight beam. Like, you can't double beam. You can't double beam. Because it just debuffs you enough to where it's able to like kill you before you get to be. The Hyper Beam actually doesn't kill. You beat Diggersby, you beat Drifloon. Of course, you're gonna beat Froslass, as I mentioned. Hyper Beam will kill both versions of Lantern, so it's actually worth it to run the Hyper Beam variation. Hyper Beam also kills Mandibuzz. I think as long as you're able to bait, you can take out Mandibuzz. You can take out a majority of the other meta, except the fighters and the Charmers. So the Charmers have to be in the zero for you to take them out. The fighters do have a strong matchup against you, unless you're, I believe, in the 2-0s. I think that's where you only beat Vigoroth, if you can actually beam it, or if you're in the 2-0s. Yes, as you see here. So you only beat Obstagoon and Vigoroth convincingly, unless you beam them to death, or if you're in the 2-0s. Now, a play you could do with Bibarel is you can actually, if you beam through shields, you can actually farm them down because the beam does such heavy damage against Obstagoon. So that's just kind of the funny part about it. Alright, so rating time, 7 out of 10. Bibarel does really well for 2 reasons. 1, you can beam everything to death. Mostly you could beam everything to death. And 2, you can act, like, as I mentioned, you can lock it into AWAC or you can lock it into Froslass. You basically auto-win that matchup. Especially AWAC because you do beat in all shield scenarios. And the funny thing is, like I mentioned, if you can beam the fighters, you have a way out. So Obstagoon, it also is able to beat the entire meta in the 2-0s. Because with what you're able to do, okay, not that simulation. What you're able to do is you're actually able to beam, well, I don't think you can beam Vigoroth to, actually, yeah, you beam Vigoroth to death. As you see, Hyper Beam does 130 damage to Vigoroth. It also is able to do, let's see, against Obstagoon. I believe it, like, one-shots Obstagoon. Or not, it gets close to one-shot. As you see, 118 damage. So you can actually take out both fighters if you're able to Hyper Beam either one of them. So I definitely recommend Hyper Beam versus Hyper Fang, because in a lot of scenarios, you won't actually get to Hyper Fang. You'll actually either surf it to death or beam it to death. It's either one. So, but I give it a strong rating just because it does do well against this meta. Like I said, if you lock it into 2 very popular meta picks, it's a lock. Justin Bibarel takes down the meta. Justin Bibarel is able to do actually really well against things like Skarmory and like Lantern. And like I said, you can beam Lantern to death if you get it, if you have Hyper Beam. You hit Hyper Beam, you're able to flip a lot of matchups. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Again, Justin Bibarel is very useful for targeting 2 specific mons and actually does well against a lot of the meta, surprisingly. So don't sleep on Justin Bibarel. Justin Bibarel will actually either beam you to death or it will wall you to death. So that's Bibarel. If you want to use it, I definitely recommend it. Like, I give it a shot, but try to get used to, like, realigning stuff to Bibarel. And if your opponent doesn't happen to have either Marowak or Froslass, you're kind of in trouble. However, they do have it. As long as you lock it into Bibarel, you're gonna have a really good time. If you guys like this video, please like and subscribe, and I will see you guys on the next video. Good luck on your Go Battle League sets.